My name is Vera Calloway. I am 23 years old, and until last Tuesday, I was the founder and chief executive officer of a moderately successful tech company I built from the code up. Now, I was just a statistic, a cautionary tale whispered in the co-working spaces and venture capital boardrooms of Boston. They said I was a shooting star that had burned out. The truth was far more deliberate and far more painful. I was pushed. The final meeting had been a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. It took place in my own conference room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the Charles River. I had chosen the Scandinavian furniture, the abstract art, the ridiculously expensive espresso machine in the corner. Now, it all felt like a stage set for my own execution. On one side of the polished oak table sat Alex, my fiancé, his face a mask of practiced sympathy. Next to him was Chloe, my business partner and former best friend from our university days, her gaze fixed on a point just over my left shoulder. Across from them all, radiating a smug, predatory calm, was Marcus Thorne, the venture capitalist who had promised us the world and was now methodically taking it away. "It's just business, Vera," Alex had said, his voice smooth and placating, the same tone he used to use after a petty argument. "The board has lost confidence. The numbers aren't there." "My numbers?" I had shot back, my own voice dangerously quiet. "The ones you and Chloe have been cooking for the last 6 months?" Chloe had the decency to flinch. Alex, however, merely steepled his fingers, a gesture he'd copied from Thorne. "We had to take decisive action. The company was hemorrhaging capital on your passion projects. Thorne's firm is assuming a controlling interest to stabilize the ship." It was a lie, elegant in its cruelty. They had created a phantom cash flow crisis, routing funds through a series of shell corporations I'd later learn were controlled by Thorne himself. They had systematically undermined my authority, cancelled key projects, and presented a doctored picture of incompetence to the board members Thorne had helped install. Alex, the man who had proposed to me on the night we secured our first round of funding, had been the inside man. Chloe, who I'd trusted with the deepest workings of my code and my heart, had been his willing accomplice. Thorne hadn't said a word through the entire charade. He simply watched me with the placid curiosity of a biologist observing a specimen squirm under a microscope. His lawyer slid a stack of papers across the table. A severance agreement. It was an insult, offering me a pittance in exchange for my silence and a non-compete clause so restrictive I wouldn't be able to code a calculator in the state of Massachusetts for the next decade. I didn't sign it, I just stood up. The silence in the room was absolute. I took one last look at the life I had built, at the 2 people I had loved and trusted most, and I saw only strangers. Their faces were distorted by a greed so profound it had become their defining feature. I walked out of the building without looking back. My keycard had already been deactivated. The security guard, a kind man named Frank who I chatted with every morning, couldn't meet my eyes. I didn't go back to the apartment I shared with Alex. I knew my things would already be boxed up, if not thrown away. I walked until my feet ached, ending up at a grimy ATM. I slid in my personal debit card, the one linked to the account I'd had since I was a teenager. The balance displayed on the screen was a final brutal punchline, $34.17. They had drained everything. For 3 days, I was a ghost. I slept on a friend's couch, a friend who knew nothing of the corporate coup, only that I'd had a bad breakup. I spent my days in the public library, using their computers to piece together the full scope of the betrayal. It was worse than I imagined. They hadn't just taken the company. They had buried me under a mountain of manufactured debt, leveraging my personal guarantees. They hadn't just left me penniless, they had made me a pariah. It was on the 4th day, huddled in a corner of the library, smelling faintly of despair and old paper, that my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a main area code. I almost ignored it, but a flicker of something boredom, desperation made me answer. "Am I speaking with Vera Calloway?" The voice was old, dry as dust. "You are," I said. "My name is Benjamin Alder." I am the executor of the estate of your late grandfather, Alistair Calloway. I have been trying to reach you. My grandfather, a man I barely remembered, a name connected to faded photographs and my mother's sad, tight-lipped silence. He had been a recluse, a difficult man who had estranged himself from the family decades ago. I knew he lived somewhere on the coast of Maine, and that was about it. He passed away 3 weeks ago, Mr. Alder continued, his tone devoid of emotion. His will was quite specific. There is a bequest for you. A bequest. The word felt alien. In the midst of my freefall, a hand had reached out from the grave. For a wild, foolish moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this was it. A lifeline. A forgotten stock portfolio. A hidden savings account. Something to get me back on my feet. There is a reading, but it's a formality, the lawyer said. Your cousins have already been dealt with. Your grandfather left you a single asset. It is, I must be frank, of questionable value. He went on to describe it. An island, a speck of granite off the coast, officially named Calloway's Folly. It came with a dilapidated cabin, a broken-down pier, and, he added with a slight, almost imperceptible sigh, $42,000 in unpaid property taxes. The town was set to seize it in 2 months. The hope died as quickly as it had been born. It wasn't a lifeline. It was an anchor, a cruel joke from a dead man I didn't know. My cousins, the ones who used to mock my second-hand clothes at family holidays, had probably received cash, property, things of actual value. I was given a rock with a bill attached. It was a perfect bookend to the week. I see, I said, the words tasting like ash. The deed and a small personal effect are here at my office in Rockland, he said. Should you choose to claim them, as if I had a choice. It was either claim a worthless, debt-ridden island or admit total and complete defeat. My pride, the only thing they hadn't managed to take from me, wouldn't allow the latter. I'll be there tomorrow, I said. And with my last $34 I bought a bus ticket to Maine. The journey north was a slow, grinding descent into a landscape that mirrored my own internal state. The sleek, optimistic architecture of Boston gave way to the tired, salt-bitten towns of the Maine coast. I stared out the grimy window of the bus, watching the world blur by, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. Just a week ago, I was negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. Now, I was counting loose change to see if I could afford a stale sandwich at the next rest stop. Mr. Alder's office was in a historic building in Rockland, smelling of sea salt, old wood, and a century of legal paperwork. He was a small, bird-like man in a tweed suit that was probably older than I was. He peered at me over a pair of half-moon glasses, his eyes sharp and assessing. He didn't offer condolences, for which I was grateful. He simply gestured to a chair and got down to business. "This is the deed to the property," he said, sliding a thick vellum envelope across his mahogany desk. "Free and clear, pending the settlement of the outstanding tax lien." He said tax lien, the way a doctor might say malignant tumor. "And this." He produced a small, heavy object. It was a key, but not an ordinary one. It was modern, made of milled steel, the kind used for high-security locks. It was attached to a heavy, tarnished brass fob, intricately stamped with a strange, jagged rune. "Your grandfather was specific that you receive this personally." I took the key. It felt cold and foreign in my hand. What did my cousins get? The question slipped out before I could stop it. A thin, humourless smile touched Mr. Alder's lips. "Your Uncle Robert received the portfolio of municipal bonds. Your cousin Sarah, the timberland up north. All very sensible, all very liquid." He paused, his gaze lingering on me. "Your grandfather was a man of particular tastes. He valued self-reliance above all else." It sounded like a justification, or perhaps a warning. I left his office with the deed in my threadbare backpack and the strange key in my pocket. The $42,000 question was, what now? I couldn't sell the island. The tax debt was more than it was worth. I couldn't afford to pay the taxes. I was trapped. I spent the night in a cheap motel, the kind that charges by the hour, and in the morning I took a ferry to a larger island from which a local fisherman had agreed to take me to Callaway's Folly for $100 I didn't have. I promised him I'd have the money when he came back for me in a week. He grunted, a sound of skeptical acceptance, and I had a feeling he'd just made a bad bet. The island appeared out of the fog like a bad omen. It was smaller than I'd imagined, a jagged tooth of dark granite clawed by the sea. A scattering of stunted, wind-blasted pines clung to its spine. The cabin was visible from the water, a sagging grey structure that looked one stiff breeze away from collapsing into a pile of driftwood. The pier he tied up to was a collection of rotten pilings and missing planks. "Nor'easter's comin' in tomorrow," the fisherman said, not looking at me as he tossed my backpack onto the treacherous dock. "She's gonna blow for a few days. You sure you want to be out here?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore. "I'll be fine," I lied. He gave me a long, pitying look, then throttled his engine and disappeared back into the grey mist, leaving me utterly and completely alone. The next hour was a litany of decay. The air was thick with the smell of low tide, wet rot, and the sharp, briny tang of gull droppings. The cabin door hung from a single rusted hinge. Inside, it was even worse. Rain had come through the roof for years. A thick layer of green and black mold covered one wall. The floorboards were soft and spongy in places. The furniture consisted of a single broken chair, a small table, and an iron wood stove, its surface a flaking crust of orange rust. A damp, musty chill had settled deep into the bones of the place. I was an engineer, a software architect. I built elegant systems from clean lines of code. This place was the opposite of everything I understood. It was chaos, entropy, a complete and catastrophic system failure. I did a quick structural assessment. The main support beams were rotted through. The foundation, what I could see of it, was crumbling. The cost to make it habitable, let alone pay the taxes, was astronomical. My grandfather hadn't left me an asset. He had left me a liability wrapped in a riddle inside a cruel joke. That night, the nor'easter hit. It wasn't a storm, it was a siege. The wind screamed like a banshee, and waves crashed against the granite shore with the force of cannonballs. The entire cabin groaned and shuddered around me. Rainwater dripped from a dozen new places in the roof. I huddled in the driest corner, wrapped in the thin jacket I'd worn from Boston, and felt a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. I was going to die here, of hypothermia or starvation, or maybe the cabin would just collapse on top of me. It would be a fittingly pathetic end to my short, disappointing career. I thought of Alex and Chloe, warm in our old apartment, probably drinking champagne to celebrate their victory. I hoped they choked on it. By the third day of the storm, the cold was a physical presence. My small supply of protein bars was gone. I was shivering constantly, my thoughts slow and syrupy. Survival. The word cut through the fog of self-pity. I needed heat. I needed a fire. The wood stove was my only hope, but I had no fuel. The damp, salt-log driftwood outside wouldn't burn. My eyes fell to the floor. The rotting floorboards. They were wood. Dry, seasoned pine, probably. At least, the parts that weren't completely waterlogged. It was a desperate, insane idea, to destroy the one thing providing a barrier between me and the frozen ground. But the cold was making the decision for me. I found a heavy iron tire iron near the hearth, probably used as a poker. I wedged it into a seam between two boards and threw my entire weight onto it. There was a satisfying crack and splinter of protesting wood. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. I had a problem, and I was taking action to solve it. It was a familiar feeling. I worked methodically, prying up the boards near the stove first. They were drier there, protected from the worst of the leaks by the stove's bulk. I broke them into smaller pieces and stacked them neatly, a small hoard of warmth. It was back-breaking work. My hands were raw and blistered. Dust and mold spores filled the air, making me cough. I was tearing up a section directly under where the stove sat, a space that had been covered for decades, when my pry bar hit something that wasn't wood or dirt. It made a dull, metallic clang. Curiosity trumped exhaustion. I scraped away the accumulated grime and debris. The subfloor here wasn't dirt and rock, like in the rest of the cabin. It was a smooth, level surface. Concrete. A concrete slab, poured perfectly level, in the middle of a dilapidated shack on a remote island. It made no sense. It was an anomaly in the data, a bug in the system. My heart began to beat a little faster. I worked with more focus, clearing the area. The outline began to emerge. A perfect square, about 3 feet by 3 feet. And in the center of one edge, recessed and filled with rust and dirt, was the unmistakable shape of a hinge. It was a hatch. I frantically scraped at the opposite side, my fingernails digging into the grime, and there it was, a recessed handle, and next to it, a circular opening. A keyhole, but not for an old-fashioned skeleton key. It was a modern, high-security disc detainer lock. Suddenly, I remembered the object in my pocket. The strange, heavy key Mr. Alder had given me. The one that felt so out of place. My hands were trembling as I retrieved it. I cleaned out the keyhole with a splinter of wood and a corner of my shirt. I pushed the key in. It slid home with a smooth, machined precision that felt utterly alien in this place of decay. I turned it. There was no resistance. Just a series of soft, satisfying clicks, like a safe tumbler falling into place. A faint hiss of air escaped from the seams of the hatch. I put my fingers under the recessed handle and pulled. It was heavy, but it lifted, assisted by pneumatic struts I hadn't seen in the gloom. They opened with a quiet, expensive sigh, holding the thick steel door open at a 45-degree angle. A wave of air washed over me. It was not the damp, moldy air of the cabin. This was different. It was cool, dry, and sterile, with a faint, clean scent of ozone and something else, something metallic. Below me, a set of steep concrete stairs descended into absolute blackness. I stood there for a long moment, the screaming wind of the nor'easter outside and the profound silence from the darkness below warring for my attention. My grandfather, the eccentric recluse, the man who valued self-reliance. This was more than just a root cellar. This was something else entirely. My phone was almost dead, but the flashlight function still worked. I took a deep breath, clicked it on, and aimed the beam into the abyss. The light cut through the darkness, revealing clean, poured concrete walls. I took the first step down. The stairs were steep, descending deeper than I would have thought possible. They were carved directly into the island's granite bedrock. The air grew cooler with each step, and the sounds of the storm faded away, replaced by a tomb-like silence broken only by the echo of my own footsteps. This was no amateur construction. The walls were smooth, the angles perfect. This was a professional and very expensive excavation. The staircase ended in a short, wide corridor. At the end of the corridor, illuminated by the weak beam of my phone, was a door. My breath caught in my throat. It was a vault door. A real one, a massive circular disc of polished steel, at least 2 feet thick, with a complex array of locking bolts and a formidable-looking combination wheel. It was federal grade, the kind of thing you see in movies about bank heists or nuclear bunkers. My heart sank. A vault, locked, of course. Another one of my grandfather's cruel jokes, to lead me this far, to show me this, and then leave it sealed. I ran my hand over the cold steel, feeling a bitter sense of defeat. Then my fingers brushed against the combination dial. It spun freely, uselessly. I pushed against the door, a futile gesture of frustration, and to my astonishment, it moved. It swung inward with a silent, perfectly balanced grace that defied its immense size. It was unlocked. It had been left open a crack, as if someone had just stepped out for a moment. My grandfather hadn't locked me out. He had invited me in. I stepped across the threshold, and the world changed. Motion sensors detected my presence, and strips of cool white LED lights flickered on, flooding the space with clean, even light. I was standing in a cavern, a vast underground chamber that was part natural sea cave, its vaulted ceilings showing the raw, beautiful texture of the granite, and part high-tech bunker. The air was climate-controlled, dry and cool. The floor was polished concrete. And it was full. To my left, parked in a row on raised platforms like offerings to a god, were cars. Not just any cars. A silver 1961 Aston Martin DB4, a blood-red 1957 Ferrari Testarossa, a sleek black McLaren F1. They were pristine, gleaming under the lights, not a speck of dust on their perfect bodies. Each one was worth a fortune. Together, they were a king's ransom. To my right, the walls were lined with industrial shelving units, the kind you see in a warehouse, but these shelves weren't holding spare parts or old files. They were stacked, neatly and methodically, with gold bars. Not the small, hand-sized bars you see in movies. These were standard depository bars, 400 troy ounces each. There were hundreds of them, pallets of them. It was a dizzying, incomprehensible amount of wealth, stacked as casually as bricks. I stumbled forward, my phone slipping from my numb fingers and clattering on the floor. I walked past the gold, my mind unable to process the scale of it. On another set of shelves were dozens of military-style footlockers. I opened one. It was filled to the brim with uncut diamonds, glowing with a soft internal fire. They felt cool and greasy to the touch, a mountain of captured starlight. I opened another locker. It contained stacks of bearer bonds, crisp and new, from Switzerland, Germany, and Japan. Untraceable, liquid wealth. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. This wasn't just a fortune. It was a nation's treasury, hidden beneath a rotting shack on a forgotten island. My grandfather hadn't been a recluse. He'd been a dragon, hoarding a treasure of unimaginable size. In the center of the cavern, sitting in a pool of its own dedicated light, was a simple, elegant setup, a heavy oak desk, a leather chair, and on the desk, a sleek, modern laptop and a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. My name, Vera, was written on it in a strong black script. My legs felt weak. I sank into the leather chair, which sighed softly under my weight. The storm, the cold, the betrayal by Alex and Chloe, it all seemed to belong to another lifetime. I picked up the envelope. The paper was thick and expensive. I broke the wax seal, which was stamped with the same jagged rune as the key fob, and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Vera," it began. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope. "If you are reading this, then I was right about you. You have my ingenuity, but more importantly, you have your grandmother's resilience. I imagine you are feeling overwhelmed. That is understandable. Take a breath. Drink the whiskey in the desk drawer. It's a 50-year-old Macallan. You've earned it." I opened the drawer. There was a bottle and a single crystal glass. I poured a measure, my hand shaking, and took a sip. The liquid fire burned a path down my throat, clearing some of the fog from my brain. I continued reading. "I know I have not been a part of your life, and for that I am truly sorry. I saw in my own children a strain of weakness, a grasping greed that I could not abide. I cut them off, and in doing so I cut myself off from you. It is my life's greatest regret, but I watched you from afar." I saw the girl who taught herself to code at 12, the young woman who built a company from nothing, who refused to take the easy path. I saw my own spirit in you, the part of me that values creation over acquisition. This place, he wrote, is the result of a long and, shall we say, colourful life. Some of it was earned, some of it was discovered, and some of it was liberated. I knew the vultures in the family would tear it apart, squander it on foolish things. So I converted it into this, something tangible, something real. And I created a test, a lock that only someone with our blood and our way of thinking could open. The letter went on to explain the island, the cabin, the vault. It was all a filtration system designed to weed out the lazy, the greedy, and the uncurious. The $42,000 tax bill was the first part of the test. It was designed to scare off anyone looking for a quick profit. Only someone with no other options, someone truly desperate, would bother with it. Someone like me. Then, the letter took a darker turn. Now for the warning. I am not the only one who knows of this place, or rather, of the legend of this place. A man named Marcus Thorne, a bottom feeder of the highest order, has been sniffing around my affairs for years. He suspects I have a cache, but he has no idea of the scale or the location. He is a man who understands leverage, and he will not hesitate to use it. My blood ran cold, Marcus Thorne. I have been following your career, and I saw when Thorne's firm invested in your company. I feared this would happen. He does not invest in people. He invests in weaknesses. He saw your partners, Alex and Chloe, for what they were, greedy, insecure, and easily manipulated, and he saw you as the key. Not just to your company, but to this place. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. The manufactured crisis at my company, the way they stripped me of everything, leaving me with nothing. It wasn't just about stealing my company. That was just the first step. They needed to make me desperate. They needed to force me onto this island. They couldn't find the vault, but they knew I was my grandfather's granddaughter. They gambled that I, with the right motivation, could. They hadn't followed me. They had herded me. He is a patient man, the letter concluded. He will have given you time to get here, time to get desperate, time to find what he could not, and he will have a team in place to take it from you the moment you do. They are likely on their way now. The laptop has all the information you need. Schematics, accounts, contacts. The rest is up to you. Be smart, be ruthless, be the woman I know you are, your loving grandfather, Alistair. As if on cue, a new sound echoed through the cavern, cutting through the silence. It was the low thrum of a powerful boat engine, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from deeper within the cavern itself. On the far side of the vault, a section of the granite wall, one I hadn't even noticed, was sliding open, revealing a dark, water-filled channel that led directly to the sea. A hidden entrance. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize me. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. Be smart, be ruthless. I looked at the incredible wealth surrounding me, then at the open vault door. I looked at the schematics on the laptop screen, which had come alive with Alistair's final keystroke. I saw the layout of the cavern, the sea entrance, the ventilation systems, and I saw the vault's control mechanism. An external locking protocol, a plan audacious and terrifying, bloomed in my mind. The boat, a black tactical inflatable, slid into the cavern's hidden marina. 4 men jumped out. They were dressed in black fatigues, armed with assault rifles, moving with quiet, professional efficiency, mercenaries. Thorne hadn't cut any corners. The last man to disembark was not a soldier. It was Alex. He looked around the cavern, his eyes wide with greedy, triumphant awe. I knew it, he breathed, a wide, ugly smile spreading across his face. I told Thorne the old man had a stash, but this is unbelievable. One of the mercenaries spoke into his radio. Target acquired. The package is secure. No sign of the girl. They thought I was gone. They thought I had taken one look and fled. I was huddled behind a pallet of gold bars, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to move. Now. While they were distracted, Their attention consumed by the glittering hoard, I slipped out of the main vault chamber. I didn't run. I moved silently along the wall, using the deep shadows cast by the shelving units as cover, just as the schematic on the laptop had shown. I found the control panel, a small, unassuming metal box near the corridor I had first entered. My grandfather's notes on the laptop had been explicit. It was an emergency override, designed to seal the vault from the outside in case of a catastrophic breach. Alex was laughing, running his hands through a crate of diamonds. All this, and we get the company too. Thorn is going to make us kings. Let's start loading, the lead mercenary commanded. Get the bonds first, they're the lightest. That was my moment. I keyed in the code from my grandfather's notes. A red light on the panel blinked green. I took a deep breath and pressed the large, friendly-looking button labelled Seal. There was no loud alarm, no klaxon, just a deep, powerful hum as the massive gears of the vault door began to turn. Alex and the mercenaries froze. Their heads snapped toward the sound. The 2-foot-thick steel door was swinging shut with a slow, inexorable finality. They realized what was happening too late. The mercenaries, trained soldiers, dropped what they were holding and made a desperate sprint for the closing gap. Alex just stood there, his face a comical mask of disbelief. 2 of the soldiers were fast enough to dive through the shrinking opening, rolling into the corridor outside. The other 2, along with Alex, were not. The door closed with a deep, resonant boom that echoed through the cavern, followed by a series of heavy thuds as the locking bolts shot home. Silence. Then, from inside the vault, a new sound, panicked, muffled shouting and the useless pounding of fists against 2 feet of solid steel. The 2 mercenaries in the corridor with me were on their feet instantly. They raised their rifles. I was exposed, standing by the control panel, my hand still on the button. We stared at each other for a heartbeat, but they weren't looking at me with aggression. They were looking at me with a strange kind of professional respect. The deal was to secure the asset for Mr. Thorn, the leader said, his voice calm. The deal did not include being sealed in a tomb with that idiot. He gestured with his rifle toward the vault. Our payment was supposed to be a percentage, wired upon completion. I found my voice. It came out steadier than I expected. Mr. Thorn is not known for honoring his deals with contractors he no longer needs. The man nodded slowly, a grim understanding passing between us. The sea entrance is on a timer. It will close in 10 minutes. After that, the only way out is the way you came in. He looked at the hatch high above. We don't have climbing gear. There's another way, I said, pointing toward a different, darker corner of the cavern, one marked on my grandfather's schematic. A boat. They exchanged a look. The leader gave a slight shrug. You're the boss now, I guess. The boat was exactly where Alistair said it would be. A sleek, low-profile speedboat, hidden in a secondary cave, fully fueled. It was called the Resilient. Of course it was. The 2 mercenaries helped me launch it. We didn't speak. We were 3 people who had, by circumstance, become allies against a common enemy. As we idled near the main sea gate, waiting for the nor'easter to blow itself out, the leader handed me a satellite phone. Thorn's private number. You should probably tell him the news. We sped out of the cavern into the grey, churning dawn. The storm had broken. I left the 2 mercenaries on a deserted stretch of coast with a thick wad of cash from a briefcase I'd grabbed from the vault in advance on their services. They would disappear. It's what they were good at. As I piloted the boat south, the coast of Maine a blur on the horizon, I dialed the number. Thorn picked up on the first ring. Is it done? He asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Oh, it's done, I said, letting the wind whip the words from my mouth. There was a pause. Vera, where is Alex? Put him on. He can't come to the phone right now, I said sweetly. He's busy counting his money. All of it. He's going to be in there for a very, very long time. The ventilation system is rated for 6 months, you know. He'll have plenty of time to appreciate his new wealth. The silence on the other end of the line was more satisfying than any scream. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the dawning realization of his colossal miscalculation. "You!" he finally hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "And you," I replied, my voice cold as the Atlantic spray on my face, "have no idea who you just made rich." I ended the call and tossed the satellite phone into the ocean. My first stop wasn't Boston. It was Geneva. The men in the quiet, discreet banks on the shores of Lake Geneva didn't ask questions. Bearer bonds were a language they understood perfectly. They were relics of an older, more clandestine world of finance, and my grandfather had accumulated a museum's worth. I liquidated a fraction of them, just enough to seed my new life. A number so large it was meaningless was transferred into a newly created, anonymous corporate entity. I paid the $42,000 in back taxes on Callaway's Folly from a laptop in a first-class lounge at the Zurich airport. Then I hired the best maritime security firm in the world to guard it. The island was no longer a liability, it was my fortress, my new base of operations. When I returned to Boston, I was no longer Vera Callaway, the victim. I was a ghost, an unseen force with a virtually unlimited supply of untraceable capital, and I had a shopping list. Marcus Thorne had built his empire on debt. He leveraged everything, using other people's money to build a fragile house of cards. I started buying that debt, quietly, through a labyrinth of shell corporations, even more complex than the ones he had used against me. I bought the debt from the banks that financed his hostile takeovers. I bought the debt on his penthouse, his fleet of cars, his private jet. I bought the debt of the company he had stolen from me, the one now being run into the ground by Chloe's mismanagement. I became his sole creditor, his alpha and his omega. He owed his entire existence to a person he didn't even know existed. The call came on a crisp autumn morning. I let it go to voicemail. I was busy. I had hired a team of architects and engineers the best in the world, and we were restoring the cabin on Callaway's Folly, not as a shack, but as a masterpiece of modern design, a glass and steel sanctuary built around the secret it concealed. We were turning the symbol of my humiliation into a monument to my victory. When the time was right, I made my move. On a Tuesday, exactly 1 year to the day since they had thrown me out, I called all of Thorne's loans due, simultaneously. The financial world called it a flash crash, a black swan event localized entirely around Thorne's holdings. For him, it was Armageddon. His assets were frozen, his lines of credit evaporated. The entire empire, built on arrogance and air, collapsed in on itself in a matter of hours. The bankruptcy filings were spectacular. The final confrontation wasn't some dramatic meeting at a remote estate. That was too theatrical. My revenge was business, just like they had told me. It took place back where it all began, in the main conference room of my old company. Their lawyers had summoned them there for a final meeting with the anonymous entity that now owned all their debt, and by extension, their lives. They walked in looking haggard and defeated. Thorne had aged a decade. Chloe looked like she'd been crying for a week. They shuffled to the table, avoiding each other's eyes. I was already there, sitting in the chairman's seat at the head of the table, the one Thorne had briefly occupied. I was looking out the window at the Charles, and I turned slowly as they entered. The colour drained from Thorne's face. Chloe made a small, choking sound. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence was thick with their ruin. "You," Thorne finally whispered, his voice a ragged croak. "Me," I said, my voice calm and even. I gestured to the chairs. "Please, sit. We have a lot to discuss." They remained standing, frozen in disbelief. "How?" Chloe stammered. "The money. Where did you—" "Let's just say I came into an inheritance," I said, allowing myself a small, cold smile. My grandfather was a firm believer in tangible assets. Thorn's disbelief curdled into fury. "This is illegal!" "You set us up. I'll have you in court for the rest of your life." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "You want to talk about illegal, Marcus? Do you want to talk about corporate espionage, fraud, the little matter of sending armed men to a private island to commit robbery? I have depositions. I have recordings. Your 2 pet soldiers were very talkative once they realized you had no intention of paying them." I leaned forward. "You don't have the money to sue me for a parking ticket. In fact, all the money you ever had now belongs to me. The company, the buildings, the sad little collection of modern art in your office. It's all mine." His rage collapsed, replaced by a desperate, pathetic pleading. He turned to Chloe as if she could help him. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Vera, I'm sorry," she sobbed. "He made me do it. Alex, he." "Save it," I said, my voice cutting through her excuses. "You made your choice. You chose money over loyalty. Alex chose it over love. You both chose poorly." Then came the final, predictable stage, begging. "Vera, please," Thorn said, his voice now a desperate whine. "We can make a deal. I can work for you. I can still be useful." I stood up and walked to the window, turning my back on them. I looked down at the city, my city, glistening in the afternoon sun. "It's just business, Marcus," I said, echoing the words he had used to destroy me. "The board has lost confidence. The numbers aren't there." I turned back to face them, my expression unreadable. "Your things have been packed. Security will escort you out. You are no longer welcome in this building." They stood there, broken and empty, the architects of their own destruction. They had tried to bury me, but they didn't realize I was a seed. I didn't watch them leave. I walked back to the head of the table, my table, and picked up the quarterly report. I had work to do, my work, my company, my future, and it was looking very, very bright.